Right, good evening everyone and welcome to May's meeting of the Customer and Corporate Services and Scrutiny Management Committee. Because of the changes to government legislation around remote meetings, we are meeting this evening in a slightly unusual fashion in that we are not formally constituted, but we felt that it was best to proceed with a public meeting in this way. So I just want to read out a brief statement just from the papers that have been circulated, just so that everybody's clear about the format in which this meeting takes place this evening. So this is not a formal meeting of this scrutiny committee. The council is operating its scrutiny and decision-making meetings in accordance with statutory requirements relating to holding COVID-safe meetings between 7th of May and the 21st of June 2021. As non-decision-making bodies, members of this council's scrutiny committees will continue to hold public informal sessions remotely for the purposes of commenting only on the business set out in the agenda below. Members of the public may register to speak in the usual way set out below. So in practical terms, the meeting will carry on exactly as we normally would be doing, but as I say, we're not formally constituted, so if we do come to making any recommendations or any proposals, we may need to revisit them just to ratify them in a formally constituted meeting in due course. But as a public meeting, just to remind you, we are being webcast, so do please make sure you've got your phone switched off and that you're in shot throughout the meeting if you can. And as with all previous meetings, I will operate on the same basis that you put your hand up within Zoom if you're wishing to speak, raise a physical hand if you want to ask a supplementary question on the particular item that's being discussed, and I'll try to bring people in as I see them in the order that the hands go up. We are joined this evening by Dawn Steele, who is the Head of Democratic Services. She's keeping her video off just for the moment because her internet connection is a little bit unstable, but she's there in the background to keep us on track, and if we do need her input, I'm sure that she'll jump in as and when needed. Likewise, I've asked Councillor Fenton to be on standby today as the Vice Chair of the committee, because I had my first COVID jab this morning, and I had AstraZeneca, and I know one or two people have had some different reactions to that. So if I suddenly keel over, or if Bill Gates suddenly takes control of me, he's on hand to take over the meeting. But all things being equal, I'm feeling all right at the minute. I've received two sets of apologies for this evening's meeting. Janie Berry, the monitoring officer, is on annual leave this week, so won't be joining us this evening as normal. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that Councillor Culloch is here in place of Councillor Mason, who is unfortunately not feeling very well this evening. Moving us on to the formal agenda's business then. Item 1 is declarations of interest. So do any members have anything to declare? I see Councillor Rowley with your hand up.
Chair, as this is an informal meeting, I feel like I can declare that should you keel over, I am on hand to help.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm not seeing anybody else with a hand up, so I shall move us on to agenda item 2, which is the minutes of the last meeting, which was held on the 12th of April. I'm happy with them as an accurate record. If anybody has any comments, I can't see any hands going up, so if you could just give me a show of hands that you're happy that I sign those when I next can. Thank you very much. I think that's a majority of the committee there. That's great. So moving us on then to agenda item 3, public participation. We don't have anybody registered to speak this evening, which means we can get straight on to agenda item 4, which is badged as the update on corporate project management approach. Although what we asked for was an update on the major projects. So I think the bulk of the annexes are on that. So we'll have Neil Ferris, who's joining us this evening to speak to the report alongside Tracy Carter and Dave Atkinson, and I anticipate questions may well focus more on the annexes than they do on the report itself. So just to introduce everybody who's joined us, we've got Dave Atkinson, Head of Programmes and Smart Place, Tracy Carter, who's the Director of Economy, Regeneration and Housing, and Neil Ferris, who's the Corporate Director for Economy and Place. I wasn't sure whether you each wanted to give us a little bit of an overview at the start of this. If one of you just wants to set us off with a sort of talk to the report. I'm seeing Neil with your hand up. And then what I'll do is then invite members to ask questions. So Neil, if you want to kick us off.
Just by way of explanation, Councillor Crawshaw, in respect of the badging of the report, since you've highlighted it, obviously the committee wanted an update as to the major projects, and obviously what we do is continually update members and the public on those major projects. So, and the report is effectively intended to reflect back to the committee how this is done on an ongoing basis. And as you rightly point out, therefore, the annexes are something that are not just subject to your own scrutiny, but public observations as these projects are taken forward. Because I think, as the rightly so, this committee is looking at a significant amount of expenditure through these capital projects, and therefore transparency and visibility of management of them, I think, is something that's really important. Just wanted to emphasise within the covering report and the presentation of it, it's something that's not just happens as a one-off every now and again. It's continually done as a part of a process. And if I could hand to Dave, he could just give you a quick summary of how that process works, and then obviously Tracy and I can pick up the actual individual annex responses, if that's okay.
That would be great, and I appreciate the explanation. And I was going to note, actually, the format that the annexes have been presented in is great, really helpful. I know it was agreed by Audit and Governance some years ago, but I don't think we've had them in this format in this committee before. Okay. And it's a really helpful format, I think, in terms of just getting that overview of how each project is looking. So Dave, I'll go over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, so this is, I think I've brought a paper similar to this to the committee before, which was actually on the project management approach. So I thought it was worth just refreshing colleagues' memories on that. We operate the All About Projects framework within the council, which is a series of steps that have gateways between that match the government Green Book guidance on business case development. All of our major projects go through this, and all of them are subject to a monthly public report, which you can see in Annex A. Sorry, I'm just reminding myself which annexes were which. In Annex A. At the moment, we've got around 20 major projects. As the Chair you said, we had this format agreed by Audit and Governance about 5 years ago. We're constantly refreshing and refining it, but it's broadly what was agreed around about 5 years ago. In order to qualify for a major project, there's an element of the All About Projects framework, which is the project assessment matrix, and on the project assessment matrix there's a series 10 criteria that lead you through to assessing what the size of the project is, and it scores out of 160, and any project at over 106 qualifies as a major project. On the corporate highlight report, we also include some of the sort of significant medium-sized projects too. So what we seek to do in terms of transparency and in terms of information for the public is try and put as many of the major projects as we can in there. There are some challenges around the difference between programs and projects and things like that, and the best way to present, but over time we've kind of settled on where we are. Neil, did you want me to carry on the annexes too?
Just to highlight how they're structured, Dave, if that's okay.
Yeah. The Annex B just gives you a workflow diagram of the All About Projects framework, just for information. Annex A is the public report, which is produced on a monthly basis. Each of the project managers do an assessment of their projects and update that, and then centrally in terms of the assurance function, we do a little bit of an editorial of that, and we seek to make sure that the reporting is consistent and the various aspects of the project are reported through properly. And then Annex C is the executive report on York Central from April. Sorry, I've not got the date in front of me.
Yeah, it's from April.
From April, yeah.
It's the latest one, obviously, Chair. You asked for a specific focus on your central, so that's the latest information. Dave, if I might ask, could you just go through the RAG rating and how that works, just to remind the committee what red, amber and green means?
Yeah. So on the front of the report, it describes the three different RAG ratings: red, amber, and green. I know, again, we covered this as a subject in terms of this committee probably about 18 months to 2 years ago. The red projects are ones that have significant risks or issues that are not necessarily not in control of the project, but there is still work to do to pull together mitigating plans for those aspects of the project. And amber is where there are issues and risks, but they are broadly within the control of the project. And then green is where every aspect of the project is operating within acceptable parameters. There is, I think when we discussed this last time, there is an element of subjectivity around this. It depends what stage of the project you're in. It depends, there's a perception element of this also, but again, we try and apply this as consistently as we can. And I think it's probably important to say that the RAG rating is the sort of a top level highlight associated with the project. It's really important when assessing the projects to look at the detail underneath, to look at the risks, how the risks are laid out, the updates and things like that. And the RAG rating just gives you a high level cover at the top.
Thank you very much. That's a really helpful summary of the information that we got in front of us, because we do have a lot of information here, which, as I say, is set out in a really helpful way. I think I'm probably in terms of inviting member questions, I think what might be helpful just before I go straight to that would be, I don't know whether Neil or Tracy, if there's anything within any of the major projects that you want to highlight or flag up to us, both in terms of either any delays or anything that's ahead of schedule, or any sort of overall considerations that we might want to put. And then I'll invite members for questions. Although just before I go to you, Tracy, I can just see Councillor Rowley with a hand up there. So
thank you, Chair. Just a really simple one. On page 16 of the report, I know we're going to talk to the report in a minute. On page 16 of the report, it talks about previous RAG period and this RAG period. It may well be in the depths of the report that I maybe have missed, but what in terms of dates and timescales, obviously we know what this period is, but are we talking quarters? Are we talking years? Are we talking 6 months? What are the periods?
Apologies, Councillor Rowley. Is this point 16 of the cover report, or 16?
Page 16, Dave. It's the summary of the RAG rating.
It's the summary of the RAG ratings. I just need to know what the period is, so I know how far back it affects.
Yeah, it's a month.
Ah, right. Okay, thank you. That's really helpful.
Thanks. So Tracy, if you could perhaps.
Yeah, so my update really kind of stems from that point, really, that the only red that you'll see on that summary relates to the Housing ICT programme, and this period on the summary you've got here is for March 2021, and I'm happy to report that the Housing ICT programme issues that were turning it red, which were due to delay and cost overrun, partly as a result of COVID, have now been resolved with the suppliers of the system. We are back in contract and we have a revised timetable for delivery, and work is progressing very well on the project. So that will change from being red in the next report when we get the next month's update on that, and I think that will either go to amber or green.
Okay, thank you. So members, what I'll do is, oh, sorry, before we get, I'm itching to get to you, but Neil's wanting to jump in as well. Go on, Neil.
Just as you're giving us the opportunity to highlight, I just wanted to highlight the resources issue on the local plan reg team. That's going to audit and governance as part of their risk register review, because obviously it's highlighted as a red on here. So just so members are aware, it's going to A&G's June meeting. And like Tracy has indicated, I'm glad to report that following from this March report. I'm envisaging that will now go to an amber. If an amber, I would say at this stage, and clearly on track to go to green. Put measures in place to resolve the issues of concern that was identified in this report at that time.
Okay, thank you. So members, over to you. I'm happy to take questions on any of the items, either within the report or within the annexes. So Councillor Kilbane, you've got your hand up first.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to find out what a missing word is on page 9, where you've got the flow chart for the projects. In the first column, we've got discover, and then about halfway down, we've got ideation and.
It'll be that stage is the ideation and problem identification. Apologies, I'm having a little bit of tech difficulty, so I can't see the report. But that block itself, underneath the discovery, is the ideation and problem identification.
Okay, thanks. Ideation is a new word on me, so thanks.
It was me too. We had some consultants work with us on the development of the discovery phase of the All About Projects framework. And I'm not a huge fan of soldering two words together in that manner, but it seems to be what the industry likes. So we thought we'd keep it.
Thank you. Councillor Fenton. Can't hear you at the moment, Councillor Fenton. I don't know if your headset's muted.
Is that any better, Chair?
That's it. I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. If in doubt, just plug it in a different socket. Just on the issue of resources that Neil mentioned, which is in some of the specific project updates, in some of them is a recurring theme. I just wondered if you could give us a sense of, in terms of the most pressing resource issues, are we talking about project management resource or more general resource in terms of the work to support project delivery? I know you gave a specific example of the local plan and steps that are being taken to bring that back into line. Just wondered if you could give us a bit of an overview on where we are with some of the other resource pressures. Thank you.
It will be project specific, Councillor Fenton, so depending on what particular aspect of resources is scarce, but it is fair to say that generally speaking, the human resource piece, the talent and skills is one of the areas that across the piece is in scarce supply when it comes to both good quality project management, but also in some of our projects specific skills, and depending on which project it is. So on the local plan, for example, actual experience of local plan process, detailed work on strategic environmental assessments, that type of skill sets are in very high demand. So we effectively have a challenge there in making sure that they're fully resourced and that the council gets the advice that it needs. Tracy, do you want to comment about more generally the construction side of the business?
Yeah, I'm just looking down at some of the projects where we have reported resourcing issues, and they tend to come up at some point during a project or a program, and then someone leaves or you have a particular glut of tasks and work that is causing issues. If you are working through a construction partner, they may also have their own resourcing issues, which will potentially influence on that. COVID has been a massive impact on resourcing, partly because we have redeployed some of our own resource to other areas. So for instance, using the ICT project as an example there, we both lost the project manager and redeployed a large number of the project team to supporting the kind of community recovery aspects at the beginning of lockdown, which created then knock-on impacts, which it's taken us quite a long time to get through. We then had to extend all of the acting up arrangements for a fairly large team on that project, all of which has been knotty to get through, but that's now resolved. So I think, in any project, you're likely to get a bit of a resource crush at some point, and we are not the kind of organisation that throws massive amounts of resource at our projects. We tend to do them very efficiently, which then sometimes leaves you a little bit kind of thin around the edges when you do get a key member of staff either leaving or unavailable.
Just supplementary to that, Tracy, where we have got key members of staff currently unavailable, are we out to, out for recruitment on those positions, or are there any blockages that we do have? Because I appreciate sometimes you might put an advert out and nobody appropriate, apply for it, but are we happy that we're doing everything we can from a council perspective to make sure that, where we've got vacancies, we're doing what we can to recruit to them?
Yeah, we've had, I suppose, a few difficulties around that, given the financial position of the council going into the year end. There were establishment controls in place to control and recruitment activity, which slowed things down because there was another kind of hurdle to get through. And we are also now approaching management restructures where there are similar controls around releasing roles. But on the projects that I'm closely involved with, there aren't any restrictions that are stopping us from filling those posts. We are moving now on the housing delivery programme and on some of the other regeneration projects into a slightly different phase of delivery, and therefore the resource requirement that you have might shift. So as an example, on a lot of our regeneration projects, we've been in those initiation phase and business case development phases, and we are now moving into construction delivery, which is a different skill set. So as part of the restructure that we're undertaking in the Place Directorate, and creating the capacity within that structure to be able to have that separation of, we are initiating, ideating, all those other words that begin with an I, in one place where we can resource up and skill up, and then we actually create a dedicated team that manage those different skills of construction management and contract management. So I think there's going to be some recruitment, certainly as with Castle Gateway, as we make the decisions to actually move into procurement, we will be resourcing up in a slightly different way, but it's always a bit of a moving feast. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful, thank you. And I've got Neil, I think you perhaps wanting to comment further, and then Councillor Kilbane with a supplementary question. So Neil, if you want to go first, and then Councillor Kilbane.
Yeah, so sometimes obviously we wouldn't recruit where we've got the skills in-house, and it's just a question of prioritisation. So it could be that we've got two projects that reach a particular pinch point. You might put one ahead of the other by 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month, because you want to, that one's more critical than the other. So the project that if effectively you've deprioritised would have a resource demand that isn't being met, whereas the one you've prioritised will be putting through. And that again is part of the discussions that we have at a DMT level as to just the impact of allocation of resources, because as Tracy says, we're not profligate in terms of over providing in terms of our skill set within the teams.
Yeah, and the other skill sets that we draw on for the delivery project are in our corporate services. So through legal, procurement, finance, we will be drawing on a relatively modest pool of resource there as well. So sometimes that phasing and staggering has to happen to be able to get the right inputs into the business case development.
Thanks. And Dave, I think you were indicating to add.
Sorry, Chair. It was just a very small point about the impact of COVID on resourcing. It's meant that some redeployments have been fairly immediate, which has meant there's been an unexpected drawn or lack of resource associated with a project. So it's not been particularly impactful, but it's not kind of been necessarily a normal thing. So we've had redeployments to the crematorium, for example, which were a response to a particular pressure at the beginning of this calendar year. And that wasn't something that within the projects had been planned for or foreseen. So just to add to what Tracy and Neil had said, there were kind of immediate type redeployments that we had to manage as well.
Thank you. Councillor Kilbane, then I think you had a supplementary question.
Yeah,
on that.
thanks, Chair. Although I think the question might have been answered, but I'm not 100% sure. Because it sounded to me as though you were saying that financial controls, in this case recruitment controls, could be the cause of one of our projects going into the red RAG rating. So we could be causing our own projects to become at risk.
No, the ICT project, which was the one with a number of staff who were due to be, they're on redeployment arrangements at the moment, and those arrangements needed to be extended. They were already in that position and they continue to work. It's just and the project was already red, but to turn it green, I needed to ensure that I had those resources in place until the end of the year. And it's probably my time and resource that got used up on that rather than the staff resource, because there's a lot of paperwork to fill in. But no, we didn't cause ourselves to go into red, but I think it's just to be aware that resource deployment on a kind of just-in-time basis, when you've got a very slimmed down resource approach, can sometimes be a bit of team enabling between one thing and another, and when there are unexpected events that can fall on you at very short notice, it's quite difficult to manage the longer term impact of those. I mean, as we went into COVID, it's worth saying that, you know, there was only one priority, and the redeployment of staff was taken very, very quickly. And we did actually acknowledge at that point that work on projects would have to slow down and even stop in some cases. So there was very little done on the housing ICT project during that time. Other projects managed to carry on, but we did have a lot of our senior project management resource dedicated to recovery.
Thanks, Tracy. Councillor Hunter.
Thank you, Chair. My question relates to paragraph 11 on page 10, the final sentence on point 1, where there's a more detailed guidance on the discovery phase and the focus on human-centred design. Can you explain a bit more what you mean by human-centred design?
Yeah, what human-centred design, that definition is designing services, processes, or things around people. So it's engagement. It follows the spirit of the Councillor Kilbane mentioned the. Sorry, apologies, I forgot to ask the question about the ideation. It follows that principle where at that early stage, you've put a heavy focus on engaging with people, engaging with residents, service users, research, and things like that, and then the point where you actually initiate the project, in theory, then you know what it is you're trying to develop. The alternative would be, I guess, the initiation for a project might be through some other means. It might be done in quite a small forum. You know, an idea might have been brought forward that it's just agreed that would be taken on board, and without the consultation, the early sort of consultations and iterations of that consultation at the beginning, you wouldn't get necessarily the right result at the end. And that's when you can. It's just I guess the principle is about having all the information you can possibly have at the outset before you initiate the project. Then you know what it is you're initiating. Then you can walk through a more linear process when you, some of our processes demand a bit more when you're actually going through it.
Thanks, Dave. And Neil, I think you had something to add.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the whole Directorate of Places, I'm very keen to make sure that everybody does understand that we don't effectively build something and have capital projects and look after place purely for the sake of looking after place and building things. We've got to be achieving outcomes for people and for residents of York. So it's a people-centred approach to construction and project management. The purpose of all this isn't just to have a fantastic building 50 stories high or built to budget. It's got to actually have a benefit to society and benefit to the residents of York. So that early stage is understanding and putting at the heart of the project, what is it that we're trying to do for people through this delivery process? It's not just about bricks and mortar.
For clarity on this informal meeting, we don't have any 50-storey buildings in the project portfolio.
Always important to just be totally clear on anything too tall, definitely. Councillor Cullick, I'll go to you next.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm very relieved to hear that we don't have such projects in the pipeline. Can I just refer briefly to pages 93 through 94, where there is reference to revised governance arrangements in place for York Central. With regard to those governance arrangements, how will their effectiveness be monitored?
So I think in this report I outline that the 17 or 18 reports we've already taken through executive, which have set out the journey that we've been on with York Central and the iterations of governance that we've had at different phases in the project. This report sets out the slight changes that have happened within the York Central Partnership and the funding arrangements, and therefore the changes to the formal governance arrangements that are set out in the partnering framework that we've signed with the York Central partners. And the effectiveness of those is assessed through the ability of the project to continue to the next phase and to continue delivering progress. The strategic board has a particular remit around looking at the effectiveness of governance for the partnership, and the executive through and the scrutiny processes that it goes through will consider the effectiveness of that governance arrangement on keeping the project on, moving on into the next phase and continuing to deliver changes. Given that the different phase that we are entering into with York Central now, the level of the financial risk that the council faces has shifted somewhat, but I think it moves into slightly softer territory about how we deliver the outcomes that we want to see from York Central, and that will be assessed through forthcoming reports to executive, where we set out what we're doing about things like delivering a council housing scheme on the site, how we are contributing to the inward investment activities on the site. That will all be pulled together in a report which will bring back the further decisions for executive to make about releasing any enterprise zone funding towards the delivery of the scheme, or entering into any kind of housing scheme on the site. There is a kind of formal process for the strategic board to look at governance, but each time the executive have a report, there is a commentary on governance within that as to whether or not that is still an effective way of managing the project. Does that answer your question, Councillor Culwick?
Councillor Cullick, you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, Tracy, thank you. That's a helpful response. Thank you.
And Councillor Rowley, I think there's a supplementary there.
It is, Chair. Thank you. And again, I don't want to step in front of my my learned colleagues. It was really, whilst we're on the subject of York Central, on page 23, which is the summary of where we are with York Central, at the bottom and the current status. It talks about communication with local residents have been undertaken. I know obviously there were some big issues around the stopping up of Lehman Road and all that whole kind of area there, and consultation with residents. Can one of the officers just give me an update as to where we are with that particular process, and what communications there has been with local residents?
So the communication around the stopping up order is slightly different from the communication around the whole programme. So I'll start with the stopping up order and then move to talk about the whole scheme. So the stopping up order is a statutory process governed by the Department for Transport, and the other three partners within the York Central Partnership were the ones making the request for a stopping up order for the scheme. That then went through a public consultation and engagement phase. Local residents in the surrounding area were consulted on a number of occasions about the process, and their formal feedback to that inquiry process led to there being an actual public inquiry which took place last week, and we are still awaiting the determination of the inspector, who will make a recommendation to the Secretary of State about the decision to stop up Lehman Road or not. But that is a statutory process outside of the kind of the partnership as a whole. With regard to community engagement and for the delivery of the whole scheme, the landowning partners have recently appointed a set of advisors, including a communications and engagement firm, who will be leading their work on engaging directly with customers. We, in that report that you see in front of you, identified a further resource allocation to the scheme so that we can maintain a communications and engagement presence within the project and continue to champion the voices of our residents in shaping the project going forwards. So we will be continuing to allocate our own comms and engagement resource to future activities that we undertake. So as an example of that, we're currently initiating some work on a housing the potential for using our own housing land to deliver as part of the housing delivery programme on York Central, and the architects company that we use for that have got an engagement arm, and they will be speaking to local residents about the potential ideas for what that scheme might look like in the future months. So we're about to embark on another strand of particular engagement on the plans for the council on York Central. The landowning partners will do the same on the development of the other aspects of the scheme as they move into both residential and commercial development. And I know that My York Central, My Future York are still engaged with the programme director and having conversations about what that next phase of engagement might look like.
Thanks, Tracy. I was going to save a question for York Central till a little bit later, but I shall just jump in because I think it relates to some of what you've been talking to there. And it's just on page 91, and I'm just wondering whether...
Could you give me paragraph references, Councillor?
Yeah,
I've only the annex.
Yes, I will. I'm just wondering whether this is possibly because some of the things in Annex A will have been published prior to some of the things in the Annex B, but paragraph 30, page 91, says that the award for the grant funding, this is talking about the 77 million, is conditional upon the delivery of the scheme benefits outlined in the HIF application and the agreed outline planning application. But in page 23 on the sort of summary document, it references conditions on award still awaited and conditionality being awaited. I'm wondering whether that conditionality has now come through, or whether we've just got a kind of an overview of what we think the conditions might be, and we're still waiting for the clarity. Because I'm conscious that this is something that now is, the money was first awarded in March 2020, and then I think we discussed it first in August 2020, and variously have gone back to it. Are we any clearer as to what the conditions around the 77 million might be?
It's been confirmed to us by the recipients of the funding that the conditionality is fairly limited. It's specific to the delivery of the scheme as defined in the HIF application and agreed in the outline planning application. So at the time when we were doing the Verto update of the programme, we hadn't had that formally confirmed by the landowners. But it isn't a long set of kind of grant conditions. It is, crack on and deliver what you said you're going to deliver. But it must be that scheme rather than a separate one. So the scale of the outputs and the nature of the scheme and the benefits as defined in the HIF application were worked up into a scheme that sits in the outline planning application, and that is what that funding is to deliver.
Okay, thanks. And I'll bring you in a second, Neil. I guess the reason I'm just asking in following on from what Councillor Rowley said is obviously he's mentioned the stopping up order and the potential for that part of the scheme not to proceed as was anticipated in the outline application. Now, I think Ian Gray has confirmed that they could still continue with the development of the site were the stopping up order not to be granted. But obviously that might require a new outline application, given that the outline application currently has Lehman Road closing and being diverted. So are we all on the same page now that we understand that potentially if the stopping up order just isn't granted, the scheme can still progress? Or because my reading of this suggests that actually if you can't deliver the outline application, the 77 million might be under threat.
I think that the conclusion from the planning consultants was that if the stopping up order was not granted, then that would require the reserved matters application for the infrastructure and the outline plan application to be reconsidered as to whether the changes that would then require were so significant that it was a completely new application, or whether it is a section 77 consent. But in either of those scenarios, it would require the funders to confirm that their funding was still conditioned on a revised, either a revised outline or a revised RMA.
Okay, thank you. You might just have to explain what a section 77 consent is.
It means you don't need to do a full, it's an amendment, a significant amendment, but to an existing planning application, but it isn't a brand new application.
Okay. Thank you. And Neil, did you want to just comment as well?
Just in terms of that, effectively that grant between MHCLG and Homes England, and obviously the Treasury approval of that, we're not party to that any documentation associated with that. So we just to be clear, our understanding is that it's for the delivery of the outline planning application, but obviously clearly it's a matter for government to make a determination as to whether or not they continue to fund an internal department or arm of government. So just the same way we could change our mind about funding something, government could as well. So, and we're not party to those.
Yeah, same applies to the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, where we are a bit closer to the conditionality that they placed on it, and that was, broadly speaking, for the scheme as defined in the outline planning application. If a stopping up order is not granted and a different road design alignment and timescale is required, it would need to go back through their investment committee cycles for them to sign that off as well.
Thank you. As I say, I don't want to dwell on it for too long. It's just that the wording in that paragraph just seemed to give a bit more information than we perhaps have previously had on that aspect. So I'm just looking at the blue hands that are up. I'm going to try and share it around a bit in terms of people who've already asked questions or not. So I'm going to go to Councillor Pearson next.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I was just going to ask about the library investment programme on page 74. Obviously, it looks like it's making good progress, and I think these new public libraries at the centre of Acomb and Clifton, and indeed in Haxby, are going to be fantastic sort of centres of the community going forward, especially with perhaps new ways of working. And you've got working from home. Maybe the library will be seen as an extension of the Home Office. I just wondered how that programme was going generally. And my other question was why Haxby isn't part of that particular programme.
Sorry, if I could just pick up on this, because I do know something about the project, even though it's not mine. It is that project is still in the initiation stages, developing the business case. And so any decisions yet for investment in those major libraries has not yet been made, but that is it doesn't sit within the Place Directorate, it's in the communities team.
Thanks, Tracy. Councillor Kilbane.
Oh, thanks, Chair. I wasn't expecting that. These are actually supplementary questions to the York Central, but I thought we'd just get totally bogged down if I asked them at the time. So in terms of the performance monitoring of the strategic partnership, is it not fair to say that we have no authority there? So therefore, we're not in a position to monitor it and review how it's doing, because essentially they are national organisations, and if there is any monitoring of performance, then that will be done by government. And so therefore, it's not something that they will not be accountable to us, as it were. That's a supplementary to Councillor Rowley's question. And the other question I've got is to do with the sort of the RAG rating and how we assess risks and what goes onto the register and what doesn't. So on page 105, sorry,
Councillor Kilbane, do you want to hold that if it's a different thing, and just let Neil come back on the first question, and then
yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Crawshaw. So in terms of accountability of that strategic board, you're right, Councillor Kilbane, in terms of those other bodies being directly accountable to us as a council. But I think they're just to reflect to the public, they're reliant on delivering this project, on the council providing them with £35 million worth of enterprise zone funding. They're reliant on us effectively agreeing that they've complied with the outline planning application and the design guide. They're reliant on us as being members of the design board, that they are effectively following and being in coherence with that design guide. So there are a number of significant project risks in respect of their delivery of the programme where we as a council can hold them to task. You are right, we can't directly hold them to account, but we can indirectly make sure they deliver, because we have a number of levers in that regard, both regulatory and also contractually when we come through to the enterprise zone fund.
So if I can just come back on that, Mr. Ferris, doesn't that just make it worse that we're going to give them £35 million and we've no direct accountability over them?
No, I didn't say we haven't got any. In terms of the enterprise zone funding, you will have direct accountability. One executive, and should executive choose to provide them that grant, that will come with conditions that you can directly hold them to account for on that enterprise zone. But you can't effectively say to the strategic board, you can't do A, B, and C, but you can actually say for the 35 million, you must do X, Y, and Z. So there will be direct accountability in respect of the EZ funding.
Okay. Can I take the other supplementary now?
Yeah, if you want to take the second question.
Okay, so just in terms of York Central on page 105 in the report, obviously the risk of the stopping up order not going through is referred to. But if we look at page 23 in terms of the RAG ratings, then it's not, I can't see it referred to at all. And I know in previous meetings, Mr. Ferris, you've said that if the stopping order doesn't go through, it will, I can't remember if it was over £100 million, you said it could cost us an inward investment, yet that's not picked up at all in the risk ratings for the project on page 23. So I'm just wondering how is it that apparently such a huge risk to the project doesn't feature?
Well, I think I have made the point you quite rightly point out, Pete, that the Councillor Kilbane, that the project funding is at risk should that not go through. And there are, in terms of the delivery of the funding, yes, I can take that on board as to whether or not we should highlight that more in this report as to that risk.
Shouldn't that be a big red square on this page that the whole project could fail?
It's not manifested itself as a risk, actually not being granted. It's a process.
So sorry, no, but risks are things that might happen in the future, aren't they?
They're not read until they're in a situation where they're not being managed. So this has been, I would put that as an amber risk. We are managing the process. We fully expect that stopping order to be given. It's in line with that.
It's not an amber risk.
You don't mark it as red just because it might happen. You mark it as red when you can't mitigate it, and the mitigations that have been put in place so far have maintained it as amber. If the inspector comes back with an
so if we could all
York Central is amber.
Sorry, Tracy, can we not all talk over each other, because I don't think that helps. Tracy, if you want to just make the point about the RAG rating, I think that the point that Councillor Kilbane is making, which I think is a fair one, in the sense of, if you're looking at this as a layperson and you have heard senior officers at the council say that if the stopping up order doesn't go through, then the whole project will fall apart and £100 million or 77 million or 45 or whatever amount we want to put, several tens of millions of pounds, is at risk. It then seems rather strange to look at the RAG rating for a project and not see it referenced at all. And I appreciate what Neil, I think, has said in terms of a risk not being recorded until it presents itself as a genuine risk, which I think is what Neil was saying. But obviously, this has been quite a high-profile public inquiry into a fairly key part of the project, so it does seem a little bit odd to not have the reference there. So Tracy, if you can finish the point you were making, Neil, I'll then bring you back in. Councillor Kilbane, I'll give you a right to reply or ask a further question if you want, but if we could try not to speak over the top of each other, that would be really helpful.
Well, firstly, just to remind you that officers did not say that if the stopping up order is not agreed, that the project will fall. We've just explained in some detail about what processes might have to be reviewed to see whether the funding stays in place. Secondly, in assessing risk on a project, your consideration, and Neil referred to this at the very beginning, is subjective as to whether or not the risk is sufficiently mitigated to turn it from green to amber to red, or red, or the other way around. So on the issue of the stopping up order, that is a risk that has always been there. It's one of many risks that, if it came to pass, could have at some point during the project have stopped the project. Our considerations of whether they're green, amber or red has always been on the balance of all those risks flying together and the level of the mitigations that you're capable of putting in place. Does it warrant a red or an amber? Given that all of the funding is currently in place, given that it has got planning, the scheme is amber. If a stopping up order had been agreed, then there may be an argument as to those things going to green, because the delivery programme would be much clearer. But because the stopping up order is a fairly critical piece of the risk assessment on this one, it remains at amber.
Thanks, Tracy. And Neil, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to clarify, the risk has absolutely been identified. It's been on one of our risk registers for the plan for many years. To my knowledge, it's just as Tracy's described. It's not as a red, while all the time you can mitigate it and can control it. And we believe that we've done that through to the public inquiry the week before last, where the Highways Authority effectively come to agreements with the NRM on a walkway agreement. And Tracy made presentations as to why it was a good outcome for the city from an economic point of view if the stopping up order was approved by the Secretary of State. So it's on balance. Yes, there's a significant risk, but we believe we've mitigated those risks, and therefore we're likely to get approval from the DfT. It would be the same way we would approach a planning risk. We would do everything to make sure that the planning application was as good as it possibly could be. Then we could have a reasonable expectation that the regulatory body would approve. Can't guarantee it, so it can't be green, but we would have a reasonable expectation that the regulatory body would approve it. And that's how it would manifest itself.
Thanks, Neil.
And I would expect to see that on this piece of paper. If you're saying it's an amber risk, then it should be there, and there should be some sort of a plan B should it come true, because at the end of the day, it's not in our control whether or not the stopping up order is granted. It's a real risk. It
is a real risk, and this committee has been through the risk register. We went through that last autumn on a number, and for audit and governance went through it as well. I believe it was identified on both of them, so it is on the risk register. But I do accept the point, Councillor Kilbane, in terms of the March report through Verto, the omission of the stopping up order inquiry is probably an omission. I would absolutely acknowledge that, because the timeliness of it in the following month was probably something that should have been picked up on that report.
Yeah, and these summary reports that you see in front of you are just a subset of the information that exists either in the project risk registers or in the Verto versions of those risks. But I accept your point, Councillor Kilbane, that risk should feature in here, and I'll make sure that it's on the Verto report for the next report.
Thanks all. I think because Councillor Musson's just popped a thing in the chat saying that her question is not relating to York Central. I think given that we're talking about York Central, I see the hands there, Tracy. I've also got Councillor Hollier and Councillor Pearson waiting. I don't know if either of you had something relating to York Central or if it's something different. I think if there's any other questions, let's get York Central done and boxed off. If anybody has anything else relating to York Central that they wanted to raise, we might as well have it now. I'm not seeing anybody indicating, in which case I will go to next on my list, which is Councillor Hollier.
Thanks, Chair. My question was just on the Outer Ring Road on page 41. It says landowners are not content about the level of improvements proposed for frontage to their site. They're canvassing support to have their case heard. I was wondering if you could just explain a bit more about what those issues are and where that case might be heard, what's that canvassing, who's it of, and what are they sort of trying to direct us to, I guess.
Okay, so there's, for the delivery of the Outer Ring Road, there's obviously land required for the delivery of the Outer Ring Road, and members have recognised in the approvals that have been through to executive that not necessarily all landowners will come to an agreement with the council for the delivery of the Outer Ring Road. So as being an arm of the state for the greater public good, we do have the powers of compulsory purchase. So the council has approved that the authority is in a position to start those compulsory purchase processes at this early stage, but not that we don't revert to them straight away, because the compulsory purchase process requires us to come to an agreement with landowners if we possibly can, but we can't do it at any price, and it effectively prevents the state being held to ransom by individual members of the public. But clearly we have to take into account the representations of those landowners, and they came to the executive decision session where this was considered, and they made their objections known to the proposals that have been put forward in respect of the design of the Outer Ring Road, specifically in the environs of the property that they own. Their views will be conveyed through the public consultation that has been undertaken. They will also be considered as part of the land negotiations to come to an amicable land sale. But clearly, if we can't come to an arrangement, then we would then bring a further report to executive to demonstrate how we've effectively tried to take into consideration the landowners' views. But ultimately, if we've ended up in a compulsory purchase situation, then why we've come to that position. But there will be multiple opportunities for those landowners to make their representations as to their needs for access to their land, the amount of their land that is necessary to be taken for the delivery of the Outer Ring Road. And of course, they have more the opportunity to comment more widely on the scheme through the normal consultation processes as well. I hope that answers your question, Councillor Howard.
Thanks. Councillor Pearson, is that a supplementary to that?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. My question was actually also on the Ring Road. It was just about the tasks and milestone status explanation says that the pre-planning consultation process has now ended and it's amber. So I just wondered why it was amber if it's all been done. And then I suppose the next question was what happens next after the consultation? Will we hear about the results of that?
So we're currently working towards a July executive report for the outcomes. Obviously, as soon as we get through an executive process, we'd then consider the consultation process green, but it's obviously just we're in the middle of it, so we're managing that as we go through. Don't envisage any issues, but until something's absolutely in the bag, so we tend not to make things green. It could be an amber, it could be a green, but I think somebody's obviously been very cautious there. It gets through the executive and then we'll work on the basis that then it's green. But clearly executive have the right to ask us to do more consultation or have a view about the nature of the consultation. So we're keeping it at amber at the moment.
Councillor Kilbane, I think that's supplementary as well.
Yeah, thanks. And so is that in case the executive turn down the plans?
No, it's not. It's about the consultation process. Executive might consider that further consultation is required. It's within their gift. Has it been sufficient? If we've had this before where members have considered that we've not undertaken sufficient consultation, so asked officers to do some more specific consultation. I think of the Foot Streets work last summer where executive specifically commissioned officers to do further work with the disabled communities to make sure that their voice was thoroughly heard by the members before they came to a final conclusion on their decisions.
Thank you. Councillor Musson next.
Thanks, Chair. My question, well, I have a few questions, but I'll start with the one around the community stadium. So on there's 2 page numbers, but the top one I'm looking at is page 34. It says that resolution to contractor claims and damages may take some time. I wondered if someone could outline the reasons why that would be, and also define roughly how much some time is?
Not our project again, so we're not going to be very well versed on the details of this. In terms of the kind of principle of any kind of claim that you make, there is a long and arduous process of evaluating your evidence base and trying to seek negotiated settlement, which then has to go through a process of arbitration. It just takes time, and sorry, I don't have any sense of where they're at with that process and how long that might be. I don't know if you do, Neil.
No, yeah, I would just concur with Tracy's point. I'm not au fait with the specific details, but sometimes it can take months, years before there's an agreement between the two parties. It just it's an agreement between two parties. It's a dispute. You can obviously draw it to a head pretty quickly by rushing off to court, but that's not necessarily in the party's interest. So it'll be down to the two parties to determine what is an appropriate time frame. When somebody's had enough, they'll tend to go to court or throw the cards in. So we'll wait and see on that.
Thanks, Neil. Just on that, I don't know whether you're in a position to give us an idea of whether, presumably there's a financial claim somewhere in here. Are we talking sort of a 6-figure claim, a 7-figure claim? Do you have a sense of what the ballpark is that the amount that's being disputed?
Sorry, no, not party to that specific dispute.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Musson, you said you had a couple of questions. Everybody else who's got their hands up, I will come to you, but they've all asked questions previously, so I'm happy to take another one from you at the moment.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Chair. So another one of the questions I wanted to ask was around the city centre access item on 5859. There's consultation sort of alluded to in there, but I wondered if you could talk in a bit more detail about how you're making sure that disabled residents are being engaged to ensure that they can continue to access the city centre, given the numerous issues that we've had regarding the Foot Streets extension and how disabled residents did feel let down by the consultation or lack of consultation. Can you reassure us the council sort of learnt lessons from that, and that, you know, consulting with disabled residents is really a key underlying theme of everything that you're doing?
Yes, in response to that piece, yeah, the executive have made it very clear in their resolutions that officers need to make sure that we thoroughly engage with that community in respect to the delivery of all the council's projects, but specifically in respect of this one. And the public consultation we're referring to there is the statutory consultation period for the traffic regulation order, and that was delayed for a month because specifically officers wanted to make sure before we entered the statutory process there was engagement with those disabled groups to ensure that we got their views in place ahead of and to feed into the executive members' decision to move to the statutory consultation on the traffic regulation order.
Thanks, Neil. I will go to Councillor Rowley next.
Thank you, Chair. So my question's about the local plan on page 30. This has been rumbling on since before Councillor Musson was probably able to vote, and it's still rumbles on. I'm just curious as to find out from officers, what are your perceived timescales to bring this to a conclusion? I do notice that there is a red there on resources, but you've mentioned there that you are bringing additional funding to help in the short term to help fast track the evidence base. So a realistic appraisal of where we are with the local plan, and what do you perceive the timescales to be to bring this to a conclusion?
So in terms of the local plan, the resource issue I think I mentioned earlier, additional resources have been brought to bear, and I expect that to change to an amber, because obviously we can't necessarily say we've got enough resources until such time as we've got past an event, particularly since that we're in the hands of the inspector as to how much homework they give us at any one particular time or what questions they bring to bear. I'm happy to report that subsequent to this report, the authority met its promises to the planning inspector in terms of delivering the green belt appraisal at the end of April. So all that information has now been submitted, and we're looking to move in subject to approval by the planning inspector to a public consultation on all the evidence that we've put in place over the last 18 months since the previous public inquiry phase in November 2019. Subsequent to the planning inspector responding to that submission of information, we will expect them to instruct us to go to a public consultation on all that information. That will be a 6-week statutory consultation, which I envisage would then take us into July. Subsequent to that, we will have to prepare a report on all those consultation responses. The inspector will be then sent the actual individual responses plus a summary of those responses, and then it will be a matter for the inspector to consider those, and it's the time frame for that is in their control. Once they're content that they understand or they've decided they wish to proceed to the next step, then we expect a notice from them to proceed to a public inquiry. That's a further statutory 6 weeks notice is required before you can have that public inquiry phase. Subsequent to that, then obviously we expect further homework from the planning inspectors. Then there's the issues of the evidence base and also the policies of the local plan to be considered. And again, that's a matter for the inspectors as to whether or not they wish to deal that with another public inquiry phase or whether or not they're content at that stage. So what I hope I'm outlining is we're in the hands of the planning inspector and there's lots of statutory timescale. But to cut a long story short, hopefully in 2022, we would expect that the inspectors would get back to us with a view that we could effectively go out with the final consultation, because there's another, I think it's an 8-week consultation, the last one, as an authority to say that we're content with the inspector's recommendations in terms of amendment to our local plan, and then only after that is it sent through to executive for approval, and then on to full council. So a long, tortuous process. And just for information, the waste and minerals plan was in inquiry in 2017, and we're still waiting for the inspector's final report on the waste and minerals plan, a process that's been entirely in the planning inspector's control for now 5 years.
I'm getting slightly worried that my 11-year-old daughter will be old enough to vote by the time we get through all of that. Councillor Rowley, I think you had a supplement.
Yeah, it was just simply to say, so we can assume that the 12th of November could be a realistic date.
Councillor Kilbane, I think have you got a supplementary there as well?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just in terms of I saw that the proposals for the Greenbelt went live, didn't they, on the website? Was it last Friday? Interesting reading. It's a question about process, really. How do you assess the risks associated with this? So on page 31, we've got an amber risk associated with the examination of local plan by planning inspectorate. So when you're weighing that up, are you trying to work out whether or not we've given them enough information, or are you trying to work out what their view of it will be, or whether or not you like their view of it? How do you come to an amber rather than like, yeah, we've got that covered, let's go, or red, no, this is going to be a disaster? How do you weigh up that risk?
Well, I think as we talked about in terms of the, and dare I say, the stopping up order, it's have we provided from our perspective as officers sufficient information in our view, and that view is formed by a number of officers and also our advisors, to reasonably expect a positive response from a regulatory body such as the planning inspector. But it stays as an amber because clearly we're not in control of the process, and as I've just outlined, the planning inspector could ask us for further information. But in order for the report and the information to be sent on to the inspectors, what officers have got to be of the view that this information is and the position of the council is a reasonable position to be taken by the authority. Otherwise it will be not possible for us to recommend it for members to take that position. So it's a reasonable expectation that the regulatory body, in this case the planning inspectorate, will take our information and give us a favourable outcome, but clearly we're not in control of that process, nor fact of have we provided enough. They will be the arbiters of that decision. So that's, I would suggest, how we would come to that conclusion.
Thanks, Neil. I've got two more people with hands up, and I've got a question myself, and then I think I'm going to wrap this up because we've done a awful lot of information there, but we've given it a good going over as well. So, Councillor Musson, I'll come to you next.
Thanks, Chair. Just a couple of quick questions around the housing ICT programme, if anyone could answer them. The first of all is that on page 59, under cost status, not 51, cost status, it says that the financial commitment has been revised. I'm assuming that it's revised to be up, isn't state. And then on page 52 of that section, it says that the go live is set for November. I wonder if that was on target for the original aspirations of the project, or how does it compare? And since someone wrote that line, are we still on track for that go live?
Yeah, I can answer that, Councillor Musson, because I'm the senior responsible owner for this project now since October. And we have worked really hard since then to try and recast the project after that hiatus, not entirely by the impact of COVID, but very significantly impacted. And the delay caused by us switching resources off has then led to, in the way that IT projects always have, a sequence, the whole sequence of modules linking with each other, all then getting out of step and needing to be renegotiated, needing to go back and re-procure through a different framework from the same supplier because that procurement framework had expired. All of the joys of an IT project all kind of rolled into one, but I'm happy to report that although the revision of the money was upwards, and that was done as part of the budget of the revision to the HRA capital programme, the work that we're undertaking now is on programme for a November go live, and I think it's probably fair to say that it's one of the biggest IT projects we'll go live with, because it's pulling together something like 17 different systems and a whole world of Excel spreadsheets into one system that's all integrated together. So the amount of preparation and testing and training that is required for that will mean that in that run up to go live, a lot of our housing officer resources will be focused on that. So I'm working with the executive member at the moment just to make sure our expectations of other levels of change and activity in that time are limited. As an example, I'm kind of working with the housing management team at the moment on changes that we might want to see us to improve the services delivered to residents. We can't make any fundamental changes to the way housing management works in that time, because the way in which their patches are sorted out, the way in which the processes all work, need to be kept steady whilst we go live, and then we can start to implement other changes. Does that give you a flavour of what we're doing in that project?
It does, yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. So I've got a last question from Councillor Kilbane, a quick question from myself, and then I'm going to suggest that we take a short adjournment. So just to give the technical staff in the background a heads up that's what I'm going to do. But Councillor Kilbane.
It's just a suggestion, actually, Chair. I know that this form comes originally from A&G, but it might be useful to have on it just a very little bit of performance management as well as sort of project management. So if there was a box on it that said when the project was originally intended to be completed, if you took something like the community stadium or the flood defences, they're years behind schedule. So if there was something on it that allowed you to have that as a focus, so that when it was all looking green and boop-de-doo, we could actually say, well, do you know what, actually we're miles off here and we need to learn from that.
Well, all I would say is that there's the big question of when we put a firm date on things. I think it's a good point, Councillor Kilbane. I think that there comes a point in terms of when do you get a date that you're willing to go firm on for delivery, and that's usually where you get into that project delivery phase. But I think it's a good point about saying, well, once you've committed to fund it, deliver it, the original base budget, the original time frame is something that we should be able to monitor against. So absolutely, clearly this gets presented to A&G on a regular basis, and we'll take that into, I'm sure Dave will take that into the internal officer group piece as well.
Yeah, I think if you look at those project stages that Dave sets out in the report, probably the first 4 of those are all undertaken with quite a lot of fluidity to timescales and to budget, and it's not until you've finalised the detailed business case are you really committing to a timescale. So I think it's that's which date would we put in, I think is a very good question, but I accept the point that having no sense of what we originally intended in that kind of large project summary doesn't give you much of a sense of where we're at.
Good point, thank you.
Thanks, thanks both. So just one final question from me, and it's specific to the Guildhall, but I think the way I want to frame it is more perhaps just across the piece for the major projects. So page 38, within the resources status explanation, it says that things are advancing as planned, but we may face delay in the near future as the contractor is reporting that their supply chain is becoming fragile, and then it gives some specifics around steel erectors labour, which I presume means scaffolders, but you perhaps can tell me that it's that or it's girders and all of that sort of thing. I'm just wondering if there's something specific to the Guildhall project and the supply chains of the Guildhall project that would affect that project only, or whether that kind of issue is something which may impact on some of the other projects that are ongoing as well. And if it is more the sort of steel girder type stuff, that would seem to me to be quite a significant and serious issue.
Yeah, it is the girders, and the construction cost risk, I think, is one that, and availability of resources for the construction projects is going to be something that's not unique to the Guildhall. And we are starting to see through our professional advisors reports of some quite worrying trends in construction costs increases rising from either COVID restrictions or Brexit trade impact, more the latter than the former. So we are going to have to be really on the ball of looking at the impacts on those on the cost estimates of all the projects that we've got that are going through into this kind of final costing stage. But I think that is a risk that we will now start to see coming through all the project risk registers.
Tracy, do you want to just say where we are with the steel?
The risk didn't come to pass. We've got the steel, and I don't know if you can look at it from the bridge, but you can actually see the main steel structure of the Guildhall appearing in the gap between the boatyard and the Guildhall itself. All of the steel work is now in there, and we're starting to see the actual walls go up to complete that structure. So in March that was a risk which didn't come to fruition.
Well, that's definitely a good news, and it answers my second question, which was going to be, do you have a sense of how long the delay may be? But evidently, not as long as we perhaps were worried it might be. Councillor Rowley, is that supplementary?
It is a supplementary, Chair, and it is on the Guildhall project. I am looking forward to hopefully very soon being able to use the chamber in the new Guildhall. And we'll see when that happens. But my question really, it's kind of not a risk or anything to do with the project in terms of its completion. I think you've been very helpful in terms of giving us information on that. This is probably a question to Neil really, and it's more of the overall use of the Guildhall, and that's in regards to lettings. Now I know we're kind of drifting out of our remit for here, but I think it's important that we understand where we are with that, because I know that you and your colleagues had put quite a lot of store on lettings, but obviously with the pandemic, what effects, if any, do you think that will have on the Guildhall project?
Well, if I can pick that up, Councillor Rowley, we have successfully negotiated a letting for the main business clubs, the business space within the Guildhall, and we are right at the end stages of signing off on the contract, having let that to university for them to operate that as a part of their science and innovation commercial units. So we've actually sorted that one out for the council. It's now their challenge to let it. Neil and I had a discussion with them this morning, and they're really excited to be taking on the space. They see it as being the kind of space that they can shape for the 21st century in a post-COVID world, and are really keen to get the keys and move in. The other aspect of the lettings on it is the restaurant space, which abuts the main Guildhall, which is now under construction. And we temporarily ceased marketing that during the course of last year, because given what was happening to the hospitality industry, it seemed not to be the best time to be trying to market new space. Once we have the construction of the frame, we will then we're going to recommence that. And having been on site and actually been in the space and seen the kinds of the setting and the context of it, I think it's still going to be a very attractive commercial space once we come out from current difficulties. And we are hopeful that our income expectations will still be met as part of the business case, but we will bring that decision back to executive once we've actually undertaken the marketing exercise.
Confirm, Tracy, that the business letting is done on business case budget? Yes,
we've achieved the target for the budget case, the business case that we took to executive.
Well done.
Right.
Well done to Neil, you and Tracy and your staff on diligently filling that space.
Right, well, on that happy note, I think we'll say thank you to Dave, Neil, and Tracy. That's been a lot of information to get through there, but I think very worthwhile session on that. So thank you very much. You're all free now to leave the virtual table. And what I'll propose that we do, committee, is I make it just after 10 to 7. So if we could just take a very short 5-minute adjournment, just give everybody a chance to give their eyes a break. And if we could come back, try to be back sort of for about 5 to 7 with a view to getting going just a bit before 7, if you see what I mean. So a 5-minute break, if you can just switch off your cameras, and we'll be back just before 7. Sorry, Councillor Kilbane.
Can I just say, you can't make a cup of tea in Yorkshire in 4 minutes.
Well, we'll make it 6 minutes then. Right, welcome back everyone to this evening's meeting of Customer and Corporate Services and Scrutiny Management Committee. As I said at the top of the meeting, we are meeting informally this evening, and if anybody wants an explanation for that, you can rewind to the start of the meeting when I read out a disclaimer. I will move us on straight away to agenda item 5, which is monitoring and tracking of approved council motions. We've got Dawn Steele here as the Head of Democratic Services, and I'll just ask Dawn to give us a very brief overview of the report that you've got in front of you and what's been done to collate the annexes, and then see if we've got any questions.
Yeah, hello everyone. So the report before you tonight is basically the culmination of a piece of ongoing work that this committee wanted us to look into in terms of reporting back on progress with council motions in recent times, and with a request from Audit and Governance Committee to do a similar piece of work. So they also referred it to CSMC. So what you see before you is a kind of summary of where we are at in terms of the progress with motions from late 2018. And you can see in the annex attached to the report those motions for which the action has been completed. That information has been gathered from CMT, Council Management Team, so our chief officers. And also within the report, I would just refer to there's a kind of a series of comparative suggestions about how monitoring of other information is done, because I know that was one of the issues that I was asked to look at in terms of, are there any existing systems we could replicate? So we've put in there by way of example the monitoring done of scrutiny recommendations basically. Currently, the current process for monitoring and tracking motions is actually done through CMT. So CMT review them once council has approved them and then allocate accordingly, and hence the responding annex with the comments from CMT representatives as to their progress to date. CMT have commented, council, what they also see a suitable process here on. It might be, if you want me to add those comments in at this stage, or do you want me to come forward with that later?
I think that would be helpful, just to have any update that you have from CMT as well. So
yeah, so the update I got was via Jane, who of course is on leave this week. I suggested that they receive them after they have been approved by full council. Well, they already do that actually. The relevant CMT member will then liaise with the relevant councillor. That's the councillor who's obviously put the motion originally forward to council. There will be an annual report to PHCMT. If there's anything of significance, the members of CMT and respective portfolio member will raise it there as appropriate. That's not substantially different from what happens now, to be fair, apart from the suggestion there's an annual report to PHCMT, and that though any issues can be raised directly within the PHCMT environment. PH standing for portfolio holders, of course.
thanks, Dawn. Your connection is just going a little bit robotic as well. So I'll jump in, and if you want to switch your video off and be a voice in the ether, as it were, then do. Perhaps if you could just use your blue hand just to indicate when you want to come back on any question or anything, and I'll just keep an eye out for it. And members, just to give you a little bit of further information. So this is something that was originally proposed for CSMC to look at in 2019, and it was on the work plan for some point during 2020. I think it was originally down as June 2020, and obviously events overtook us. But it's been rumbling around in the background. What you'll see from the annex is that we've tried to go through as many of the motions as have been passed, taking out the resolves and then looking at what's happened to those resolves. So the further back in time they are, the less information there is, and I think I would argue that, you know, going forward, just having completed next to a resolve isn't satisfactory. It needs to have some sense of what information, you know, what was done as a result of it. But as you get to the more recent motions, you do start to see, quite a lot more information being gathered there. Dawn mentioned that one of the things that we identified very quickly was that there wasn't a sort of a closing of the loop between the person proposing a motion and then finding out sort of what happens after it's passed. So, if you're the person who's proposed a motion to council, there's 3 resolves. Those resolves are all accepted unanimously by the council. You don't necessarily ever get a confirmation to say, yes, we have written the letter you've asked us to write, or yes, it has gone to the scrutiny committee you've asked it to go to, or whatever else it might be. So we've had some discussion about how that part of it might close up. One of the things that has some consideration was given to was whether or not this committee might have a role in terms of monitoring, because obviously with the scrutiny reports, when we do a scrutiny review and there are recommendations made, there's a process whereby the outcomes of a review or recommendation come back to this committee, and the committee says, yes, we're happy that they've all been discharged appropriately and therefore we don't need to monitoring it anymore, or no, actually we think that there's still 1 or 2 outstanding, we'd like it to come back again in 6 months time, or what have you. So it's just a way of what might be the best mechanism to have a public forum to say, yes, this motion was passed and this is what was done, and we're now happy that it's been resolved or it hasn't been dealt with. So I have a couple of suggestions that I might want to make to us as a committee, but I'm happy just to take any questions or hear any thoughts about how we might proceed with this. And obviously, just reminding everybody again that we are currently meeting informally, so if we do want to make any sort of formal proposal or recommendation, we can do it, we can record it, but we may need to revisit it at a future stage just to make it properly constitutional. So Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all those involved in pulling this together. I think it's helpful to understand where we are in terms of the status of the various motions that have been approved. I suppose the sort of first thought I had, I was surprised that Democratic Services have had no involvement in logging monitoring of motions. So I think that would be, without wanting to create additional work for Democratic Services, I think there needs to be a central list of what has been agreed. Agree that it then falls to the service departments and the relative executive members to take forward those recommendations and sort of enact accordingly. In terms of the monitoring report, yeah, good idea. Maybe 6 monthly rather than annually in the first instance. I suppose you could make a case for saying it could go to audit and governance, for wearing their governance hat, or this committee, but I'm not too concerned which of those it would be. But those just a few initial thoughts.
Thanks, Councillor Fenton. Councillor Kilbane.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and very useful report, a very interesting reading, actually, seeing what's happened and what hasn't happened. And I'd support the comments from Councillor Fenton there. And just to give it a bit of context as well, on page 119, the motion and resolution about youth clubs from just over 2 years ago, had that been actually carried through, then boy, would we be relying on them now. We've got lots of young people coming out of lockdown, who are starting to assemble in large numbers around the city with no facilities to use. So it's kind of, making sure we follow through on the motions that we pass, I think is really important. And to use the old adage, what gets measured gets done. So if there is a way of checking up on progress, then I think we should do it. I guess my only thing to add to Councillor Fenton's suggestions would be whether or not it should sit with, in terms of the progress on it, reports on it, whether or not that should sit within the relevant scrutiny committee. So if it was about youth, in this case, youth clubs, that committee might have more general or more information in the round about youth provision. So that might be a better place to take the report as to progress, because they may be able to add something. There may be something additional that they can chuck into the pot, and then maybe once a year, it could all come to CSMC as the sort of central scrutiny committee to say what's been done and what hasn't, just as a sort of a monitoring of performance.
Thanks, Councillor Kilbane. I think that's certainly an interesting suggestion in terms of if we were to model something similar to the scrutiny reviews, where there's an expectation of feedback after 6 months, say, and if that feedback went to the relevant scrutiny committee, and then we did an annual report through either CSMC or A&G in terms of just an overview of where we are with motions and how they've been dealt with. What I'm mindful of within all of this is I think Councillor Fenton, you sort of alluded to not laying everything on the shoulders of DEM services, and I'm conscious of not creating additional work where there isn't resources available to actually deliver on it. So I think perhaps I mean, Dawn, I see you popping. I don't know if you want to comment on any of the suggestions that have been made. All broadly in line with, I think, some of the conversations that we'd had already. But Dawn, if you want to just comment.
Yeah, if you can hear me, I would just say being involved. What I would say is we are actually involved because we produce the minutes that contain all the motions. Can you hear me?
We can, yeah, we can hear you okay.
Yeah, it just keeps flicking in and out from here. So we produce the minutes that contain all the motions and all the details with the people who were responsible for action on it. From that point forward, this comes back to the resource question as well again, Johnny. From that point forward, it's always been considered that was Democratic Services' role done. I understand the point because it's that issue about whether we are actually the appropriate people or not. I think there probably is a groundswell of opinion within the council that, well, where else does he sit? There was a view taken before when this first came up that actually it would sit with CMT because of the resource difficulties again, you know, and the comparatively small team that we have to support the volume of meetings that we do at the moment. I'm not averse to us running another system. What I was keen to ensure was we didn't run another system parallel to one we'd already got, because that's duplication of effort. So in actual fact, all the information that is required to progress it is contained within the current council minutes. So I would be a bit reluctant to have another system. I don't mind picking up off that somehow and extracting that information and putting it into some kind of scrutiny report periodically. We could just pull it and then chase the updates from CMT, but initially CMT would be the right people that it would have to go to because we're not the action owners. Those would be.
I think my sense is that, because obviously it's been quite a big piece of work to look back to every motion since 2018 and go through and work out what was and wasn't passed and you know, pull it all together into a document. I think going forward, even if we were looking at a sort of a 6-monthly report that just came to CSMC, you're not looking at quite the same volume of following up and chasing. So I certainly from my perspective, you know, as chair of the committee, looking at it from a sort of a process point of view, having that annex and that document that clearly lays out this is what council has resolved, this is what's happened as a result of that, is quite helpful, because then what we can do is go along and say, well, actually, you know, this thing that we've all agreed to hasn't happened, or this thing has happened, and therefore we're happy that we sign that off and it's done. I think that there's also benefit in it being published through whether it's A&G or Scrutiny, because then there's that public record of saying, you know, we held a public meeting, we in public voted in this particular way, and we can now evidence that, you know, the letter was written or the committee did do this, that or the other. And so I think, you know, we shouldn't lose sight of that aspect of it as well. Councillor Kilbane, I'll just bring you in if it's a further comment, and then I'll perhaps just summarise what we perhaps might do next.
I think there is a role for scrutiny here, though. So if you took the resolution that I put through on county lines in 2019, the CMT might be saying that, yeah, we've done that and it's completed, and I might be saying, well, I don't think you have. I don't think that's what was in the motion. So there can be a difference of opinion, can't there? And if there's a difference of opinion as to what was the appropriate thing to do or not, then some sort of scrutiny would be the best place to air those views and come to some sort of resolution as to whether or not it was finished or not. I mean, the alternative to that is to have the individual member who raised the motion to have that discussion with the CMT member and see if they come to agreement or not and report that back. But I just personally, I'd be more comfortable if there was a role for scrutiny in it because of the expertise that those committees bring.
I think, yeah, I understand that. I think probably the way in which I would see that working would be, as you mentioned, if we have a clear line of saying to the person who proposes the motion, and this is the senior officer who's taken ownership of that particular resolve, then straight away that means that the proposer can follow up on their own motion with a named person to say, you know, what's happened here. I think in terms of a scrutiny perspective, if we're looking at this in the round and we're saying, okay, we've seen, you know, 10 motions have passed and actually nothing's happened on any of them, then we want to be looking at what the blockage is there on the general issues. If we're saying actually 90% of the motions that have come through, the resolves have been dealt with, everything, we're happy with it all, but we're not quite clear about this particular aspect, then that's where the individual scrutiny committee can potentially say, actually, we want to ask the relevant officer, the relevant exec member to come with a report that says, explain, you know, how you took that forward, what you've done around that particular issue, or perhaps there's a good reason for why you haven't done anything, because, you know, let's be honest, there are sometimes resolves in council motions that are fairly difficult to either evidence that anything's been done because they're a bit nebulous, or perhaps might not be possible for local authorities to actually deliver on sometimes in and of themselves, and that then is an entirely different question about, you know, what we do in terms of writing of motions. But I think it might be useful for members to have that perspective of sort of saying, well, you know, you put this thing into a motion, but these are the reasons why we haven't been able to deliver it. Councillor Fenton.
Thanks, Chair. It's a good idea for scrutiny to be cited on motions that relate to their work areas. Again, so there's visibility, and I mean, hopefully it we shouldn't be looking at duplication here. There should be one version of the truth containing, you know, all of the information that's contained in this report in terms of who proposed the motion, who's the responsible officer, what were the recommendations, what's the status. You know, you can add a column in saying, you know, relevant scrutiny committee or scrutiny committees, and then the chairs of those committees can, they know what, you know, if it's provided to them or they know where to find it, they can say, okay, well, what are the motions relating to my work area that have been passed? How do they relate to work we're currently looking at, and how can the committee sort of play its part in making sure that relevant actions have happened? So hopefully we shouldn't be creating too much work or duplication if we just, this sort of sharing of information, really. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Fenton. And Councillor Musson.
Thanks, Chair. Perhaps just to repeat what other people have already said, but you are asking for feedback. So I think the public forum is a good idea. I think it's important for us to have transparency. I think the public already have, you know, a good transparency into us making the decisions and debating the motions, but perhaps where they're lacking is the transparency of that implementation. So I think those updates happening in a public forum, if it can happen that way, is positive. I think having the senior officer ownership straight away is really good. I know we had a similar discussion about the updates of motions. I think at this committee, not motions, petitions. And I think we highlighted a couple that maybe didn't have a name against them and they weren't really going progress. I was thinking particularly of the living wage petition. So I think having the ownership publicly out there as soon as possible is a good idea. And then the final point is just because I think we've bandied about a couple of timeframes, a yearly, biannually. I think my preference would be every 6 months if it was possible, if the resource allowed, because I think on some of these resolves, I think a year is a long time for some of the recommendations to not be started. I think a year can make a massive difference. Just to pick one example, to not have a youth club. So I think if we could do every 6 months, it would be positive.
Thanks, Councillor Musson. I think where I am on it, on that last point around the 6 months or a year, I think there's two different things to my mind. So we have a process with these scrutiny reviews where once the recommendations are accepted, then there's automatically a report 6 months later coming to well, it comes to CSMC. But if you said within 6 months of a motion being passed, then a report came through to the relevant scrutiny committee to say these were the resolves, this is what's happened to it, and you know, we can see whether we need to follow up anything further from that point, then that sort of boxes off you're not leaving things for too long. And then if we're looking at just collating all of that information, I'm sort of looking at Dawn here and not trying to give her too much work for her team, but those reviews can then all be collated into a single document like this annex that we have here, which essentially, if we can keep that as a kind of a live document that this committee can then review on an annual basis, that says, rather than the specifics of particular motions, you know, we generally are happy that motions are dealt with in a timely manner. We're generally happy that the majority of resolves are actioned and delivered. You know, then great. If we think that there's a problem in terms of actually 50% of all the motions that we pass don't go anywhere, then we, from the corporate perspective, might want to look at what happens in terms of process and in terms of the structures around, you know, how is full council's decisions articulated, how do they actually carry on through. And as I say, some of that might be that actually we need to look at the way that motions are worded in the first place so that they are actually deliverable if they do get passed. And some of it might be, well, actually, hold on a minute, you might have had this motion passed by full council, but somebody somewhere has decided they don't like it. You know, that's not democratic. We need to think about how that part of it works. But I think it's important to keep the distinction between the two things of the kind of the overall process around motions and how we manage them versus the individual motion, where, as I think it was Councillor Kilbane said, you know, an individual committee may have more expertise around the delivery of a particular motion or know what questions to ask or how to understand the answers that are given. And as I say, I think that sense of closing that loop around transparency around it, because as Councillor Musson says, you know, we very publicly debate motions, we very publicly pass them or not, but you don't always see what comes out at the end of it in a public way. So being mindful of the fact that we can't necessarily make a formal, sorry, Dawn, were you just putting your hand up, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say in sort of response to all of that, I'd be happy if we were to use, we've already started in essence by creating that annex. Do you know what I mean? So if we use that annex as almost like a roving Excel spreadsheet, adding to it from now on in, perhaps look at adding in another column along the lines of the one that Stephen suggested, and we can use that then easily without creating too much more work. I'll turn my camera off again. And perhaps we could sort out the finer details at one of our work planning sessions, you know, in terms of the finer details of how we get engagement with that document through CMT and then forward it on to other people. Because what I would not want us to be is for democratic services to become a bit of a go-between, you know, to some extent, because that's the time-consuming bit. Happy to pick up all the references to scrutiny, etc. But if there's a genuine issue about wording, about delivery, as you were alluding to, Chair, you know, an implementation that is between the action owner and the mover, then that might be a simple issue that's resolved by a conversation directly between the two. Whether that's before it's ever got agreed, you know, before it goes to council, or whether it's subsequent to council approval. There's just a bit of room for negotiation in that part, I think, is what I would like to see, you know, if at all possible, so that we didn't become, to put it, you know, to use Councillor Kilbane's example, not to become the mouthpiece of Councillor Kilbane with a specific director or department, etc. Because, you know.
I don't worry, I think Councillor Kilbane is very effective at being his own mouthpiece, so there's no worry for that. I guess maybe in terms of I guess maybe in terms of this meeting and going forward, then perhaps the sensible thing would be for myself and Councillor Fenton as chair and vice chair, with yourself and whether it's Janie or other relevant officers, if we just try to come up with a summary of what we've discussed this evening. I think we're all broadly speaking on the same page around a willingness to maintain what's on the annex as a kind of a live document with a clear sort of time frame for scrutiny's involvement, and we can discuss the finer points of exactly how that works. But if we can bring something back to this committee when we are a formally constituted committee with some options that we can then recommend, and whether or not it needs executive to approve a recommendation as to a new process or not, I'm not sure, but that would seem like a sensible next step in terms of what we do from this evening, given that we can't necessarily make a formal recommendation right now. Does that sound to everybody like a sensible step for us to take? Seeing nods. Yeah, great, fantastic. In which case, as I say, I think we're all on the same page. So if we do that in the next week or two. Sorry, Councillor Pearson, was that a hand up, or is that
just a question, Chair? Obviously,
yeah.
Page 112.15, we've got members are asked to obviously consider the information provided. Next steps. 4.2. Sorry, you might have been coming to this, Chair. Sorry, is do we need to report anything back to audit and governance?
That's a very good point. I guess that we might want to hang on until we've got some formal options and then take them back. But if committee are keen for me to, I'm very happy to engage with the chair and vice chair of audit and governance as well, and just relay what we've discussed and see whether they want an involvement in formulating any options such that when we endorse them, they are universally endorsable.
It certainly might be worth looping them in.
Yeah, very happy to do that. Okay, fab. Right, in which case, I've got an eye on the clock now, and I promised Councillor Culloch that we'd be done by 5:30. We've got 3 minutes. I'm sure that the next couple of bits will be relatively quick, won't they, everyone? So next item is item 6, which is the work plan. I just wanted to highlight to everybody that June's meetings are all planned to be forum meetings, with the possible exception of CSMC, which is to be confirmed. I will just double check. But that will mean that every committee is meeting with the relevant portfolio holder and the relevant corporate director to discuss the next municipal year's work plan, with a view to obviously this last year has been a little bit ad hoc with the way that we've done things. We now have the corporate calendar set out for the next year. It'd be nice to get the sort of the bones of a work plan set out for each committee over the next year, with obviously still the flexibility to have these commission scrutiny slots as and when we need to. But given that all of those meetings will be taking place as forum meetings, then we skip the need for any issues around whether we're holding face-to-face or public meetings, remote meetings, because those meetings can go ahead as remote meetings, given that they're not normally public meetings. We then have the corporate calendar set up from July onwards, and my understanding is that, assuming that everything proceeds in the way that is anticipated nationally, then we will be looking at face-to-face meetings from the 21st of June onwards. But as I say, there is a working group within the council looking at that, and it is a bit of a moving feast, I think, at the moment. So we do have a little bit of time from a scrutiny perspective, in that we've got health and adult social care meeting tomorrow, economy in place on the 25th, both on the same basis that we've met this evening, and then with the exception of this committee on the 14th of June, by the time anybody else is due to meet in public, it will be under whatever new regime we are operating under. So unless there's any questions on any of that, not seeing any, so I shall shift us straight on to item 7, which is urgent business. We don't have any urgent business, and that means that we are at the end of the meeting. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much to the technical team for delivering the meeting, and for Dem Services for delivering a beautiful full colour meeting. I can't tell you how much easier it is to read a RAG rating when you can actually see what colour it is. So thank you very much indeed for that. Thanks for your time this evening, and